Chris asked me to talk about the issue, a broad overview of the issues of heat stress. So hopefully try to convince you that it's a massive economic problem that we've been just tolerating for years, as almost viewing it as an egg engineering problem. We need to build a better barn, we need to build a better mister, etc. But I think there's biological systems that we are able to now manipulate, either with nutrition or pharmaceutical, to recapture some of this lost productivity. So I want to make sure everyone understands, though, right from the beginning, we're not talking about fever. We're talking about environmentally induced heat stress, and the biology of the two are incredibly different, right? So this is seasonal heat stress is very different than a fever. I would contend that Chris already mentioned it, but every area in the United States experiences some type of lost productivity due to seasonality, and I would also probably strongly argue that every place in the world probably experiences some type of seasonality. I was in Denmark 4 months ago, right? So a very northern country, worried about heat stress in their south. Well, clearly it's an economic issue, and it's difficult to estimate what the costs are, but it's probably about $1 billion issue in the dairy industry, and Steve Pullman gave a really nice talk at the Midwest meetings in 2009 or 10, and he calculated it as almost a $900 million problem in the American swine industry. Half of that coming from the repro side, the other half coming from the finishing side. It's about double the economic impact of PRRS, and the Chinese government has come out and stated that heat stress is the largest impediment to them being able to feed their own country. So it's just this huge environmental constraint on productivity that we've been dealing with now forever, and hopefully now we have some ideas on how to overcome it. I've already talked about the cost. Globally, you see huge estimates. It's likely a $100 billion problem. So hence you see why if a pharmaceutical company or a nutrition company could come up with a target molecule that could help alleviate the negative consequences of heat stress, the market opportunity is just massive, right? It's just a colossal opportunity to recapture productivity. Of course, heat abatement is the primary strategy to minimize heat stress, right? Cool cells, evaporative cooling, shades, etc. But a lot of developing countries, of course, and some small stakeholders may lack the resources. We've already talked about largest impediment to animal agriculture. It threatens food security, and it certainly regionalizes animal agriculture, right? There's a reason why animals are typically located within the country, primarily based upon these environmental constraints. Okay, the issue's likely going to get worse, even if you don't believe in climate change. But if climate change is happening, the issue is going to get worse. But probably a bigger issue with heat stress isn't so much on climate change, but on genetic selection. We genetically select animals based primarily upon productive traits, muscle growth, piglets per litter, etc., milk yield. These are traits, these are processes that generate a lot of metabolic heat. So the more metabolic heat an animal is producing, the more susceptible they will be to heat stress. So synthesizing and maintaining muscle generates a lot of metabolic heat. Synthesizing fetuses generates a lot of metabolic heat. These animals who are more productive in these economically valuable traits are going to be more susceptible to heat stress. I don't see us changing the way we genetically select animals based upon productivity. And of course, the world's becoming more wealthy. Wealthy people choose meat to eat, right? So the increase in meat consumption is occurring, and a lot of this increase in economic affluence is taking place near and around the equator, warm parts of the globe, and it's likely that animal agriculture will migrate with this increase in economic vitality. So what are the issues? So when I was in Arizona, I was working primarily on heat stress in cattle. I moved to Iowa and started talking to producers, and here's what I hear. Producers complaining simply that they just won't finish, right? It's hard to get those last 30 pounds, 20 pounds to get them to market weight. The variability in market weight increases. The variability in growth is during heat stress is 3 times that of during thermoneutral conditions. So the variation in pigs leaving the barn and body weight becomes larger. The packers complain about flimsy fat or seam fat issues. Seasonal infertility. Weaned estrus levels are increased, failure to express estrus, conception rates, maintaining pregnancy, so these slip litters that producers are complaining about. I think Jason and Tim are going to talk more about seasonal infertility in a second. Mortality. Obviously, animals die from heat stress, and it's typically that late gestating sow, the sow that has the largest economic investment on the entire farm. And of course, varying parameters are negatively affected. Pigs born alive, birth weight, weaning rate, etc. So these are just some of the issues. And now I want to talk a little bit about the biology and specifically the etiology of heat stress and how does it occur. I think most of it's, in my opinion, starting at the gut. And I'll try to convince you of that now. When animals become heat stressed, there's a redistribution of blood. There's a cardiovascular event where you have vasodilation at the skin. Just like you and I, when we get hot, you'd have a vasodilation at the skin, our faces get red. We're trying to maximize radiant heat dissipation. If you're going to vasodilate one large section of the body, you have to vasoconstrict the other part somewhere else, otherwise the animal dies of low blood pressure. What vasoconstricts is the gut. And unfortunately, the cells lining the intestine are incredibly sensitive to hypoxia, or low levels of oxygen. And they start to die within hours. And I'll show you some data in a second. So you have the coordinated vasoconstriction in the intestine that causes a reactive oxygenated species buildup in the enterocytes. You also then have digestion continuing, but absorption is being blunted. So now that develops osmotic stress in the lumen of the intestine. Instead of water being osmotically pulled into the enterocytes, you have water being pulled from the body into the lumen of the GI tract. So that causes osmotic stress as well. And this is just kind of a busy slide, but in an animal experiencing heat load, you have this cardiovascular event, the gut constricts, you develop reactive oxygenated species, you get intestinal permeability, and now endotoxins that normally remain inside the lumen of the GI tract, which are there always, right? Remember, the GI tract is a tube essentially running from the animal's mouth to the anus. And everything inside of that tube is outside of the body. And inside of that tube is a relatively inhospitable environment, right? It's chock full of enzymes, acids, and endotoxins. And those endotoxins normally end up in your toilet and the pig's manure, no big deal. But if that integrity of the intestine, of that barrier becomes compromised, now the endotoxins have a chance to seep or infiltrate into the body. And that causes an inflammatory response, and in fact, it can ultimately kill the animal. In fact, many times when humans or animals die from heat stroke, they die the next day, not from hyperthermia, but from the massive endotoxemia that occurs because of the compromised GI tract. Endotoxins, one of the primary ones that we write about often, or we study, is called lipopolysaccharide. It's a natural component of gram-negative bacterial cell wall. Like I said, it's always in the GI tract. Your GI tract is chock full of it. It's no big deal normally because there's a barrier preventing it from getting inside the body. But during heat stress, some LPS has the opportunity to infiltrate into the body. And this is just a little cartoon showing different enterocytes. And these enterocytes are the cells lining the intestine, and they're held together by these proteins. Each cell then makes and secretes a protein that lodges on the membrane and connects with its neighboring cell. And this tight junction protein then prevents luminal endotoxins from seeping in. But if these tight junction proteins are compromised, now the endotoxins have an opportunity and essentially becomes a highway. One of the first things we wanted to do was identify what's going on. So we utilize a pair feeding model where we always have heat-stressed pigs that are allowed to eat ad libitum, no problem. And we measure that reduction in feed intake. And then we only allow the thermoneutral pigs to consume the same quantity of feed. So that eliminates then this confounding effect of dissimilar nutrient intake. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So the questions we had when we first started getting into the heat stress research was, are there direct effects of heat versus indirect? The indirect effects of heat being mediated simply by reduced feed intake. Because forever we've always thought that reduced productivity, whether or not it's chickens, cows, or pigs, reduced productivity is simply the result of reduced feed intake. The animal gets hot, they consume less feed, and they produce less. Right? That's been the dogma forever. But I think we've generated now evidence to suggest that's not the case, and that there are direct effects of heat that have they're not dependent upon the reduction in feed intake. So we want to look at production, metabolism, leaky gut, and then we were very interested in utero heat stress and how it affects future body temperature and productivity. So this is what the data looks like. This is rectal temperature on the y-axis, Dave, the experiment on the x-axis. The solid lines are pigs that are in heat stress, and they're allowed to eat ad libitum. The pair-fed, the thermoneutral pigs are right here, so their body rectal temperature doesn't change. Interestingly, the pair-fed thermoneutral pigs, the pigs that are being fed to the same level as the heat stress pigs, have a marked reduction in feed intake, and that just demonstrates and illustrates nicely, I think, how much body temperature is dependent upon the thermic effect of digestion. It's a large amount of energy. Anyway, that's not the story. This is feed intake on the x-axis. Again, this is the thermoneutral ad libitum pigs. This is the heat stress pigs. Of course, there's a marked reduction in feed intake, and then by design, the dashed line pigs, remember, they're in thermoneutral conditions. So we have two groups of pigs, both consuming the same quantity of feed. One's heat stressed and one isn't. That's the only difference. Okay? It's a large decrease in feed intake. What happens to body weight? This is, to me, remarkable. This is the thermoneutral pigs. After 7 days, the thermoneutral ad libitum pigs gained about 7 kilos, just like you'd anticipate. The heat stress pigs, they gained after 7 days 1 kilo, 1.5 kilos. The pair-fed thermoneutral pigs, these two groups of pigs were consuming the same quantity of feed, but the pair-fed pigs actually lost almost 4 kilograms of body weight in a week. So you got two groups of pigs, one's hot, one's in thermoneutral conditions. They're both consuming the same quantity of feed, but there's a difference in body weight of almost 5 kilos. The energetics of 5 kilos of body weight in 7 days is just, it's insane. It's an enormous amount of energy. That's the difference between the two. And in fact, our hypothesis was that the heat stress pigs would grow slower than the pair-fed pigs. It actually grew faster. And we now know that most of that tissue that the pigs were accumulating, the heat stress pigs were accumulating, was adipose tissue, right? Much less valuable tissue. The plasma energetics, I just wanted you to concentrate on insulin for right now. These are the thermoneutral ad libitum pigs. These are the heat stress pigs. Remember, these two groups of pigs are consuming the same quantity of feed. It doesn't make sense that a heat-stressed animal, I would argue that's a hypercatabolic condition, right? The animal's about to die from hyperthermia. Why would it have increased levels of the most anabolic hormone that we know of, insulin? Doesn't make sense for an animal that's in a hypercatabolic condition to have increased levels of an anabolic hormone. But it happens in cattle, it happens in pigs, it happens in chickens, and it happens in rodents. Probably happens in humans too, I bet. Well, this increase in insulin explains then why the heat-stressed animal refuses to mobilize adipose tissue. And in fact, it probably explains why it accumulates more adipose tissue, because insulin is a lipogenic hormone. So the pair-fed pigs are breaking down their back fat, mobilizing adipose tissue, and the heat-stressed pigs are not. So the heat-stressed pigs get fatter, the pair-feds just get thinner. This is just a simple picture showing the ileum, the architecture of the ileum. This is a thermoneutral ad libitum pig. This is the heat stress. It's difficult to even identify villi structures. It's just like it's marked damage occurring in the heat stress ileum. Interestingly, now we've done this both in cattle and in pigs. Simply pair feeding is hard on the GI tract. The villi become shortened and wider. Hallmarks of an of a compromised intestine. Anyway, that's for a different talk. Anyway, the summary up to this point is that reduced feed intake appears to explain much of the reduced growth. In fact, a severely heat-stressed animal actually grow quicker than a pair-fed animal. There's large differences in tissue growth. That tissue is the exact opposite tissue we want. It's lipid, it's fat, not protein. And there's large differences in insulin and adipose tissue metabolism. There's gut breakdown, endotoxin infiltration. I don't have time today to talk about potential dietary strategies, but I think we as an industry have an opportunity at the gut to stop the negative consequences of heat stress right at the beginning. And I think the beginning is the gut. Anyway, obviously, though, the producer needs to primarily control the environment. That's postnatal effects of heat stress. Now I want to talk to you about in utero effects of heat stress. Okay? So postnatal is expensive, but what about those pigs that are gestating in June, July, and August and go to market in February, March? Are they negatively affected by the environment that they were in utero? So our objectives were to determine the postnatal responses to offspring whose mothers were heat stressed on body temperature, production, etc. We implanted these little devices called eye buttons so we can measure body temperature every 5 minutes. We did this for 2 different experiments I'm going to show you now. I don't want to waste your time with all the details because I got about 100 more slides to go. But That's not, that was a bad joke. But long story short, I'm going to show you two experiments. Both experiments essentially say the same thing. When animals are derived from heat-stressed sows, their body temperature is about 0.3 of a degree centigrade, so about almost 0.6 of a degree Fahrenheit, higher than if they were derived from a thermoneutral sow. This is during heat stress. These are sow lines from adult pigs, right? 40-kilogram pigs that came from heat-stressed sows. These are coming from thermoneutral sows. And the long story short is, again, on this particular experiment, during a subsequent heat stress, pigs that were derived from heat-stressed sows have an increased body temperature of about 3 degrees Celsius. That was a constant heat load. We wanted to see what happens in two things. One, does that increase in body temperature remain in thermoneutral conditions? And does it remain in a heat load that resembles a natural setting, so a cyclical heat stress? Well, the story is the same. Doesn't matter. This is thermoneutral conditions. I'm not going to waste. And this is the cycling heat stress. And this is if they were heat stressed the entire gestation, or just the first half of gestation, or just the second half of gestation. The long story short, it really doesn't matter. If they experience heat stress in utero, their entire life, they will increase a body temperature of about 0.3 of a degree centigrade. That may seem insignificant to you. I'm going to put some numbers to it here in a second. Could this be indicative of an altered set point in the hypothalamus? If so, then this animal has to generate increased heat throughout its entire life. Where does that thermal energy come from? It comes from feed energy. Someone's paying for that thermal energy, right? So that increases maintenance costs. It likely reduces performance, reduces feed efficiency because that's energy that someone had to pay for, and it probably increases time to finish. So I did the calculations. This increase in body temperature is about 6.97 megacalories of thermal energy. Big deal, right? Well, I'm going to show you in a second. I think it is a big deal. Let's just simply do the math on this. That's 3.5 megacalories, assuming the average energy content of a kilo of feed. Do the math, 33 cents per kilo, etc., blah, 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 66 cents per pig. It would cost extra to get them to finishing. Well, on a 10,000 head barn, that's $6,000, $10,000 more in additional feed costs that's occurring in February and March, just from the in utero heat stress back in July and August. What about future body composition? Well, this is protein accretion rates. This is Jay Johnson's PhD work in my lab, and this is looking at protein accretion. These are pigs coming from gestational thermoneutral conditions, and these are pigs coming from gestational heat stress. And this is between 60 and 80 kilograms of body weight. So pigs that were gestated during heat stress, between the body weights of 60 and 80 kilograms of postnatal body weight, there is a 15% reduction in the ability to accrete lean tissue. It's even more pronounced when you look at adipose tissue. It's a 35%. The pigs coming from gestational heat stress have a 32% increase in their adipose tissue accretion rates. So that's 1/8 of a pound a day of extra adipose tissue. And then, of course, the adipose to protein ratio becomes even more pronounced when you add the two together. It's 95%. Anyway, pigs exposed to in utero heat stress increase adipose tissue accretion compared to controls. This is during the early finishing phase, and I suspect as you get out heavier body weights, this difference is going to become even more and more pronounced. Reduced carcass quality, efficiency of lean tissue production, likely due to hyperinsulinemia. Dr. Jason Ross is I'm not going to be showing any insulin effect, but pigs that were thrown from heat-stressed sows have an increased levels of basal insulin their whole life as well. And that has huge implications with regards to body composition. So they have an increased propensity to synthesize adipose tissue, reduced capacity to synthesize lean tissue. The efficiency becomes compromised, and this has huge economic implications, especially if you combine the body composition data with the body temperature data. Now you're having an increased feed cost with the body temperature, and of course reduced synthesis of a valued tissue like muscle. Anyway, I'm not going to take the time to go through this slide, but We spend a lot of time making it, so I like to show it. I think so the heat-stressed animals are very complex, right? You got the hypothalamus, pituitary, the GI tract, muscle, thyroid hormones, etc. I think the big part of the problem may originate at the GI tract, and I think there's with nutrition, I think there's ways that we can mitigate that effect. Anyway, heat stress is an incredibly complex issue. I've only talked to you about just a few things. In summary of the seminar, heat stress markedly alters metabolism that it has independent of reduced feed intake. It costs everyone in the industry, right? This, like Chris already mentioned before the talk, PERS hits 10% of the industry. Heat stress hits every single producer in the country. In utero, heat stress is, I think, an underappreciated constraint on efficient productivity, something we probably even haven't been looking for. But the implications are huge, economically huge. If you combine postnatal and in utero heat stress together, this creates an economic burden that it probably dwarfs all other issues in the industry. It's something we need to be paying more attention to.